Hey guys, very important interview with John MearSheimer and Max Hastings on Tom Switzer show on YouTube. I'm gonna go over it because they mention very important points here. Both John and Max are, expert in their fields. I just wanna, highlight some of their points because I believe it's super important to pay attention to those and we'll just go over some excerpts from this video and talk about them.
Well, John, I mean, and we will deal with Russia and Ukraine because I know that both of you disagree on this subject. But John, Max makes the point that US power is shriveling. But then again, the United States, as you well know, paid dearly in blood, treasure, prestige, credibility, legitimacy, all of that during the forever wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. You and I were talking a lot during that period, during the global war on terror in the 2000s. The Bush administration cost America dearly in prestige and credibility. What's so different this time? John?
So he mentions, Tom mentions that, how Iraq war kind of damaged the credibility of the US. And, it was the first time basically that happened to the US credibility. Before that, US was, a credible, government, a credible country. Allies could count on, its intelligence, its, words, its announcements. But, somehow George W. Bush, by, coming up with this mass weapons of destruction and how it, they never found the weapons of mass destruction, how it, kind of damaged the credibility of the US government, its intelligence assessments. And, let's see what John says about that.
Well, I think President Trump is sui generis. I think there's no question that the United States did quite a bit of damage to its reputation during the Vietnam War, and it did quite a bit of damage to its reputation and its ability to project power around the world in the Iraq War of 2003. There's no question about that. But this is very different. And the key point you want to remember about President Trump is that he is a unilateralist of the sort we have never seen before. He is sui generis. Virtually every president before Trump thought that international institutions were very important. They thought that international law was very important. In fact, the United States created those institutions, wrote those laws, and thought that those multilateral institutions and the rules that attend them were in America's self-interest. The same thing is true with international law. This is not to say we didn't occasionally violate the rules or the laws, but we thought they were important.
So John so far argues that the United States and its allies were the ones who created those international laws. And it actually works in favor of the US government. And Trump, on the other hand, has no regard for the international law and basically saying that it's actually binding my hands, because I want to do so many things, make America great again, but these international laws are binding my hands, tying my hands. They don't let me do what I want to do. But John says it actually works, in the long run, it's going to work against the U.S.'s interests, because actually the U.S. was the one who created, these laws, and for the most part, it works in favor of the U.S. interests.
President Trump does not think that institutions or international law are useful. In fact, he thinks they're counterproductive. He thinks that laws and institutions are where the Lilliputians tied down Gulliver. So he is dissing all these institutions and international law. Furthermore, virtually every president before Trump believed that it was important to have allies around the world and to treat them with respect. President Trump treats allies worse than he treats adversaries.
He's not wrong. President Trump has not been treating the allies kindly. You can talk about Greenland, Canada, Mexico to a certain extent, European allies, Ukraine, which is, to a great extent as an American ally. And he's obviously quite right that he's not been treating them kindly.
There's that famous Henry Kissinger quip that there's only one thing worse than being an American adversary, and that's being an ally of the United States. That was not true. That was not true before President Trump. Now, the second big point that I want to make, which reinforces that, is that I think that President Trump, once he got into the Iran war and it became clear that we were going to lose the Iran war, began to flail around. That's what you see happening now. And he looks like a mad king. He may be a mad king, as Max is saying, but I'm not sure about that. Regardless, he's acting more or less like a mad king. And when you take his basic unilateralist tendencies before February 28th and you marry that to the situation that he's now in, I mean, he is desperate. This is a devastating defeat for him, and he has no way out. He's not used to this. He thinks he always wins. He thinks he can get himself out of any box that he gets himself into. He can't do that here.
So John again argues that Trump is, in his character, is a unilateral person. He doesn't take advice from, opposing views. He wants to do things a certain way that doesn't match the way the U.S. government is run, and he's not wrong. Again, he's quite right in this matter. And right now, John says that Trump is stuck in this situation. He wants to get out, but he can't. And yeah, I do not disagree with John, because that's quite what's happening here. And we have to wait and see what happens. It's quite a feat, what Iran has achieved so far in this war.
And that is making him crazier than ever. And I think this is why we're not only in so much trouble today, but I would argue, Max and Tom, that moving forward, the situation is likely to get worse, not better.
Well, Max, you recently wrote an essay in the Observer newspaper.
So why is he saying that he doesn't have a way out? Because Trump can declare victory and get out of this war, but the thing is, the Strait of Hormuz right now, it's closed, and if he gets out without determining what happens to the Strait of Hormuz, then so many things will come after that, and there are so many unknowns and so many different countries' interest at stake here. So there has to be they have to figure out a way to resolve the situation in the Strait of Hormuz before he pulled out of this war.
And the headline, and we'll put this on the screen, the United States could soon be our enemy. And you go on to make the point that in less than a decade, the American leadership that the West took for granted has collapsed. Now we are forced to consider the previously unthinkable. Max Hastings.
Now, this is very interesting. Tom brings up this article by Max, who he wrote it in Observer, and I recommend you to read it if you can. I don't know if it's under behind a paywall or not. And he says the United States could soon be our enemy. And that's a big thing to say, given the history of Europe and the United States for the past, at least for the past 70 years. It's been an unbreakable alliance between especially Western Europe and the United States. And Max is, he's never say something just because he wants to say it, because he has some, facts and theory behind it to back his points.
Hastings.
This is what makes us so scared. One of the things I'm very boring about is I keep going back to quoting my hero among historians, the wisest man I've ever known, now dead 6 or 7 years, Professor Sir Michael Howard. And
Oxford University.
Michael was a very close friend of mine. And I remember so many of the things, the words of wisdom that I heard Michael say. And one or two of them spring to mind now. The first he said, and this is probably this conversation of about 6-7 years ago, well, before he died. He said, we talk too much about peace. He said, peace is not the important word. He said, the important words are order and stability. Order and stability are what matter most to the world. And order and stability are what Donald Trump is knowingly and willfully banishing. He also said, not.
So he brings this important point that, peace is not really what matters. It's order and stability. Because, so many times you hear that, oh, we want peace. But if there is no order and disability not disability, stability, when peace is achieved, that peace is not sustainable. It will collapse soon because there is no order. And that's the thing that happens with Israel when, they sign a peace agreement with Israel, like, Palestinian authorities or different Palestinian factions. Because there's no order, there's no stability in that peace agreement, it will collapse very soon. So that's just an example. And, even if peace is achieved between United States and Iran, there's no stability because it's very fragile. It will collapse soon, in my opinion. And I think Max also has similar opinion about not the Iran war, but in general, how the U.S. government is behaving.
Nothing important can ever be achieved without allies and partners, and that relates to what John just said. And it's the willingness, the absolute refusal to consult with or to discuss with. And those of us, John has written many distinguished books, and I've written one or two less distinguished ones. But when I look back, and I wrote a book a few years ago about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I had some fairly weird emails after it was published to my website from Americans who said, how can you speak so well of John F. Kennedy when he treated women so badly? And I responded to them and I said, it may well be true that John F. Kennedy treated women very badly, but he was a man of remarkable wisdom who, when I studied, as we're all able to study through the White House tapes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the manner in which Kennedy handled himself, this was a man who knew a lot, who thought a lot, and who cared. He cared about the world. He had compassion. He had wisdom. He had all sorts of other qualities, all of which Donald Trump is bereft of. With Trump, everything is about Donald Trump. He is a supreme narcissist. And again, I've said not only in the column I wrote the other day, but in other columns before this, that, all right, we all know that there's always an element of bullshit.
So Max compares Donald Trump to John F. Kennedy, and he says he's the opposite of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy being a very, very wise man in terms of how to deal with international crises, and Donald Trump, on the other hand, is not acting very wisely. I would recommend you guys to listen to this entire podcast. My video is taking too long. I'll come back with another video with John MearSheimer on how he analyzes Iran's reaction to the war. Take care and see you later.